Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it, taking pieces of our strength until we wonder if we have anything left. But sometimes in the quietest places, a miracle waits to be found, reminding us that love and loyalty never truly disappear. You're about to witness a journey that will stir your heart and leave you thinking about second chances in a whole new way. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more stories, and tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. James Walker was a black man whose life once carried the sharp discipline and dignity of an officer in uniform, but now it felt like an unfinished story written in silence. 3 years ago, in the heat of a warehouse raid that went wrong, flames tore through steel and brick, stealing the legs from under him and leaving him bound to a wheelchair. He had been respected, admired, feared even by criminals, but the moment the blast hurled him into darkness, everything he thought permanent was stripped away. He survived, but survival felt hollow without the partner who had been by his side through every shift, every pursuit, every late-night patrol. Max, his German Shepherd, his K9 companion, had vanished into that fiery chaos, never seen again. Officials told him the dog had perished, but James never found a body. That absence was worse than death. It was an open wound that never closed. In the years that followed, James retreated into himself. His modest cabin on the edge of Riverstone became less a home and more a bunker. The sound of wheels on the wooden floor replaced the steady rhythm of boots he once wore with pride. Neighbors spoke politely but avoided lingering. Friends from the force came for a time, but their visits grew shorter, their words more awkward, until finally they stopped coming altogether. What could they say to a man who had lost not only his legs, but also his sense of belonging? James bore his silence with the stoicism expected of him, but inside the quiet carved deeper and deeper. On sleepless nights, he found himself whispering Max's name, half hoping some unseen hand might guide the dog back, half knowing the prayer was useless. He was proud, but pride did not fill the empty chair beside him. He was strong, but strength did not soften the loneliness that ate away at him with every sunrise. His therapist, a kind woman who had seen many veterans collapse under grief, suggested a new dog. Not to replace Max, she said gently, but to give you something to hold onto again. James dismissed the idea with a shake of his head. Replace Max? It felt like betrayal, as though trying to paste over the face of someone irreplaceable. But as the months dragged into years, silence hardened into despair. The nightmares of the explosion returned often, and waking life was no easier. He had no partner's bark to ground him, no familiar weight leaning against his leg to remind him he wasn't alone. Then one gray morning, with drizzle soaking the pavement and mist curling low over Riverstone's tired rooftops, James steered his chair down the street toward the squat brick building with the faded sign, Riverstone Animal Shelter. He told himself he was just going to look to prove to the therapist he had tried. Nothing more. The rain clung to his jacket, and wet leaves stuck to the rubber of his wheels. The sky was the same color as ash, pressing low, as though to remind him of smoke and loss. His heart tightened with every push of the chair, his jaw clenched against the urge to turn back. At the doorway he paused, his breath misting in the cool air, memories crowding his chest. He wanted to retreat, to sink back into the safety of solitude, but before he could, the door swung open. Grace Reynolds, the shelter manager, stepped out with a smile that carried both weariness and kindness. She had known hardship too, widowed early. She poured her life into giving unwanted animals another chance. Her hazel eyes softened when she saw him. "Officer Walker," she said, her tone respectful. James lifted his chin slightly, though the badge no longer rested on his chest. "Just James now," he murmured. Still, hearing the title made his heart ache with a strange mix of pride and loss. Grace gestured him inside. The smell of bleach and damp fur filled the air, familiar yet foreign after so many years. Corridors stretched out, lined with kennels alive with sound. Dogs barked, howled, leapt against the bars, each voice clamoring for attention. A golden retriever wagged its tail furiously, a beagle howled with persistence. Mutts jumped and barked in chaotic harmony. But James's expression remained guarded. his eyes drifting past them as though afraid to focus, afraid to let anything inside. His hands tightened on the rims of his wheels, the whiteness of his knuckles betraying the storm beneath his controlled exterior. Grace walked beside him quietly. "Take your time," she said softly. "They're all waiting for someone." James barely nodded. He told himself again, "I'm not here to choose. I'm just here to look." But as he rolled further down the row, his breath grew shallow. Near the very end of the corridor, in the quietest corner, lay a German Shepherd. Unlike the others, he did not bark, did not rush forward. He remained curled in the shadows, his coat rough and patchy, scars visible across his flank and one ear. His frame was thinner than it should have been, his body worn by hardship. For a moment James's chest froze, his pulse pounding louder than the noise of the shelter. The dog lifted his head slowly, almost reluctantly, and amber eyes met James's gray ones. They were weary eyes, but they carried a depth he knew too well. His breath caught, his lips forming a name he hadn't spoken in years, barely above a whisper. Max. The world seemed to still, the barking around them fading into silence. Grace Reynolds, still standing beside him, leaned closer in shock. "James, you know this dog?" Her voice faltered in disbelief, because in all her months of watching this broken animal lie in the shadows, she had never seen him stir. James swallowed hard, his voice raw. "He's not just some dog. He's my partner. He went missing 3 years ago. I thought he was gone forever." Grace's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as she looked between the man in the wheelchair and the scarred shepherd. She shook her head slowly. "That can't be. He's been here months, but he's never reacted to anyone. He doesn't even respond to feeding time. Yet now look at him." Max gave another low bark, hesitant but certain, and his ears flicked at the sound of James's voice. James felt the tears spill unrestrained, hot on his face, and he reached for the only thing that felt true, the old service command. His lips shook as he spoke. "Sit." For a moment the world held its breath. Grace blinked in silence. The other dogs stilled in their cages, as though sensing something sacred unfolding. And then Max, scarred and weary, lowered his haunches to the floor with the obedience of memory, his muscles trembling, but his will unbroken. James gasped, choking on a sob, and pressed his palm flat against the bars as though reaching across time itself. Grace's voice quivered. He remembers." James nodded, unable to speak, because the sight of his partner following a command after 3 lost years was too much for his soul to carry at once. The memories rushed in like a flood. Night patrols beneath amber street lamps, the chase of suspects into dark alleys, Max's steady breathing by his side after long shifts, the bark that once meant danger, safety, trust. All of it returned in a single heartbeat. Max leaned forward, his nose pressing harder against James's hand, and released a sound between a whimper and a sigh, the sound of recognition. James whispered, his throat thick, "You came back to me." Grace crouched beside him, her eyes shining now too, her hand hovering near the bars, though she dared not interrupt the bond. "James, I've never seen anything like this. He's been half dead since we brought him in. No interest in people, no trust. And now this. It's like he's waking up from a nightmare." James nodded slowly, his tears still flowing, but his expression lifting for the first time in years. He never forgot. Even when the world thought he was gone, he remembered me. Grace steadied herself before asking, "Where did you lose him?" James's voice cracked as he answered, "A raid on a warehouse. There was an explosion. They told me he never made it out. But if he's here, that means he survived somehow." Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, then whispered, "Maybe some bonds don't break, no matter what the world throws at them." Max gave another bark, sharper this time, as though responding, and James felt the sound strike him like a pledge renewed. He drew in a ragged breath and leaned even closer, whispering, "Good boy. You're still my partner." Grace touched James's shoulder gently, her voice soft. "Do you understand what this means? He hasn't let anyone close to him. Not once. The staff even thought about putting him down because he refused to eat properly. And now look." James closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by both rage at the thought of losing Max forever and gratitude that fate had kept them apart only to bring them together again. When he opened them, the steel of determination gleamed where sorrow had once reigned. "I'm not leaving him here," he said firmly. "I don't care what the policies are. He belongs with me." Grace hesitated, practicality warring with compassion, but the truth stood before her undeniable. She saw the man's trembling hands and the dog's amber eyes fixed on him, and realized some reunions were written too deeply to deny. "James," she said gently, "this will not be easy. He's older now, injured, frightened. You'll need patience." James's jaw set, his broad shoulders squaring as though he still wore the badge. "James, he's older now. He's been through hell. He's not the same dog you remember. Are you sure you can handle this?" James swallowed, his jaw set with a grim determination she recognized from men who had seen too much but refused to yield. "I don't care if he's older. I don't care if he's broken. I'm broken too. We'll heal together." Grace looked down at the shepherd, at the scars that marred his once proud frame, at the stiffness in his leg and the weariness in his posture. The vet said he's 9, maybe 10. He limps on that hind leg. He growls at strangers. He refuses food some days. He's not adoptable in the usual sense. We usually keep dogs like him until, she faltered, unwilling to say the word. James's voice cut through like steel. "Until you put them down." Grace hesitated, her throat tightening. "We don't want to, but resources." James cut her off, his voice rising for the first time in years. "Don't finish that sentence. Not with him. Not with my partner." His gray eyes burned, a mixture of fury and pain, and his hand shook as he reached through the bars again, this time with steadier resolve. Max pressed harder into the touch, his tail thumping faintly against the floor. The sound echoed like a drumbeat in James's chest. Grace exhaled slowly, realizing she was witnessing not just reunion but resurrection, and she knew the man in the wheelchair would not leave without the dog at his side. She rose slowly and folded her arms, speaking in the firm tone of someone who wanted to prepare him for the truth. "If you want him, there are steps. We don't release difficult cases lightly. You'll have to come back, prove to us you can manage him, that he won't hurt you or anyone else. And James, he will need more care than most. Vet visits, therapy, patience. He may never be the same." James wheeled closer to the kennel, his shoulders squared. "Neither am I. But that doesn't mean we don't deserve another chance." Grace's hazel eyes softened, the corners moist with tears she didn't expect. She nodded once, almost reverently. "Then let's start the process." She motioned for a young staff member, Kevin, lanky and nervous, who fumbled with the keys. "Bring him out," Grace said softly. Kevin blinked. "Now, he doesn't do well out of the cage." Grace met his eyes firmly. "With him, he will." Kevin approached, slipping the key into the lock. Max stiffened immediately, his muscles coiling, a low growl vibrating in his chest. James's voice broke through, calm and commanding, the way it had in alleys and warehouses years before. "Easy, Max. It's me." The growl stopped as though cut by a blade. Max's ears flicked forward, his gaze locked on James, and he stood, trembling, his body scarred but his spirit unbroken. Kevin opened the gate slowly. Max stepped out, hesitant, his paws clicking against the linoleum floor, his frame thinner than memory, but unmistakably proud. James extended his hand again, his heart racing. Max lowered his head, pressing it firmly into James's palm. Grace's breath caught. My God, he remembers. James let out a ragged laugh, part sob, part relief. Of course he does. He was never just a dog. He was my partner. Kevin scratched his head nervously, watching the scene unfold. He's never let anyone near him like this. He always snaps. But now it's like he knows. Grace's voice softened. Some bonds don't break, not even after years. James reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a worn leather collar, one he had never been able to throw away. The brass tag still gleamed faintly with the engraving. Max K 9 Unit. His hands shook as he fastened it gently around the dog's neck. Max stood still, no resistance, only a faint wag of his tail, as though acknowledging the return of something long lost. Grace placed a hand on James's shoulder. He'll need time to adjust, to trust again. But if anyone can bring him back to life, it's you. James nodded, his voice steady. I don't want him to go back to who he was. I want him to be who he is now, with me. Max paused at the threshold, his ears flicking back, his body stiff with hesitation. For 3 years, he had known nothing but loss, hunger, and the walls of cages. Now freedom stood in front of him, but freedom carried its own terror. James felt the leash tug slightly, his heart tightening at the dog's doubt. He loosened his grip, letting the leash fall slack, and leaned forward in his chair. It's all right, partner, he said softly, his voice filled with the steady assurance that had once guided Max through dark alleys and dangerous raids. You're not alone this time. Welcome home. Max blinked slowly, then took a step forward, then another, until he crossed the threshold and settled at James's right side once more. Grace wiped at her eyes as she whispered, "Go home, boys." The drive back to James's cabin was quiet, broken only by the steady hum of the modified truck and the soft sound of Max's breathing as he curled in the passenger seat, his head resting against the worn fabric. Every so often, his amber eyes lifted to study James as though confirming he was truly there, not another fleeting dream. James gripped the wheel tightly, his throat thick. He remembered countless patrols with Max sitting exactly there, eyes alert, muscles ready, the silent comfort of knowing he was never alone in the fight. Now they were returning not as officer and K9, but as two survivors, scarred and weary, but alive together. The cabin sat at the edge of Riverstone, its cedar siding weathered, its fence sagging with neglect. It was not much, but it was all James had. He rolled down the ramp, the wheels clicking against the wooden planks, and glanced back as Max stepped cautiously onto the porch. The shepherd's nose twitched, sniffing the air, catching the scents of wood smoke, coffee, and loneliness that had filled the house for years. Inside, Max's nails tapped against the floor as he circled the living room, nose brushing the old furniture, the worn rug, the cold hearth. James watched him carefully, fear and hope mingling in his chest. Would Max accept this place? Would he find peace here? Max paused, his gaze turning back toward James, then padded to his side and lay down beside the wheelchair, pressing his body close as if to claim the space not just as a house, but as home. James bent as far as the chair allowed, stroking the coarse fur with trembling hands. "It's not much, Max," he whispered, "but it's ours." That night, James wheeled into the bedroom and parked the chair beside the bed. He had grown used to sleeping alone, to the silence that echoed louder than any voice. But as the moonlight spilled across the floor, Max curled at the foot of the bed, his head resting near the wheels of the chair, his breathing slow and steady. James reached down, brushing his fingers against the shepherd's back. "Welcome home," he murmured. Max's tail thumped once against the floor, a soft, tired gesture that carried more power than any metal. James closed his eyes, for the first time in years, feeling the heaviness of sleep without the sharp edge of nightmares. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting stripes across the hardwood floor. James wheeled himself into the kitchen, preparing a bowl of water and a modest serving of kibble. Max approached slowly, sniffed, and then began to eat, his throat working in steady gulps. James felt pride swell in his chest at the sight, pride not only in Max, but in the simple fact that they were here, together, beginning again. Later that afternoon, James wheeled out onto the porch, Max following with deliberate loyalty. Across the narrow street, a boy rode a battered red bicycle in uneven circles, his laughter carrying faintly through the crisp air. His name was Daniel Miller, the 10-year-old neighbor who lived with his widowed mother, Emily. James had seen them before, but never spoken much, keeping his distance as solitude demanded. Daniel stopped abruptly when he noticed Max, his eyes wide with wonder. He let the bike fall against the grass and took a few hesitant steps forward. "Whoa," he breathed. "That's a German Shepherd." Max stiffened, his ears twitching back, his body lowering slightly in cautious defense. James raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Easy, Max." Daniel crouched low, extending a hand, his voice soft with the innocence of youth. "It's okay, boy. I won't hurt you." James held his breath, bracing for a growl or snap. But Max's amber eyes studied the boy carefully, his body tense, and then, after a long moment, he lowered his head, taking a cautious step forward. His nose twitched, sniffing the boy's hand. Daniel's fingers brushed the coarse fur gently, and Max exhaled a tired but willing breath. James felt his chest loosen as relief washed through him. Daniel's face lit with a grin. "He likes me." James smiled faintly, the expression unfamiliar on his face. "Seems he does." From the doorway of the Miller house, Emily stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her long brown hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, her eyes shadowed by fatigue, but carrying a natural warmth. "Daniel," she called, her voice a mixture of protectiveness and apology. "Don't bother Mr. Walker." James raised a hand in reassurance. The morning after Daniel first touched Max's scarred fur, James Walker wheeled himself into the backyard of his cabin with a small whistle in hand, the kind he had not lifted to his lips since the night of the warehouse explosion. The grass was still wet with dew, the cool air sharp in his lungs, and Max padded slowly beside him, his limp visible but his posture proud, ears alert as though waiting for command. James's heart pounded, because he knew this was more than a test of obedience. It was a test of memory, of trust, of whether the bond that had survived 3 years of absence could still carry weight in the present. He raised the whistle, blew a short, sharp note, and his voice followed, steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Sit." Max's ears flicked immediately, his amber eyes locking on James, and with the precision of old training, he lowered his haunches to the damp grass. Relief surged through James, a shaky laugh bursting from his throat as he whispered, "Good boy." Encouraged, he tried again. "Stay." Max froze, not a muscle twitching, his gaze unblinking, the way he had done countless times during patrols. James felt pride swell, tears burning behind his eyes, because here in his backyard, for the first time since the explosion, he was not broken officer and forgotten dog. He was a man with his partner again. But the world has a way of reminding even the strongest hearts that scars run deep. A sudden clap of wood from a neighbor's construction project cracked through the morning, sharp and violent, a sound too close to an explosion. Max flinched violently, his body dropping low to the ground, tail pressed tight against his belly. He barked sharply, frantic, his amber eyes darting around as though the yard itself had turned into a battlefield. James froze, the whistle falling from his hand into the grass, his heart clenching at the sight of his partner unraveling. "Easy, Max," he said softly, his voice no longer an officer's command but a friend's reassurance. He wheeled forward slowly, resting a hand on the shepherd's trembling shoulder until Max's chest heaved less violently, until his body began to ease. James exhaled, his throat thick. He realized with brutal clarity that both of them carried wounds that were invisible but no less real, wounds that no command or discipline could erase. They would have to learn to heal not as master and servant, not even as officer and K9, but as two broken souls walking the same road. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at the cabin door. Grace Reynolds stepped in, her arms full of supplies in a brown paper bag. She had been visiting often since the adoption began, checking not only on Max's adjustment, but also on James, her quiet presence a reminder that second chances required community. She wore a thick wool coat, her auburn hair pulled back, her cheeks flushed from the autumn chill. She smiled when she saw Max lying near James's chair, his amber eyes lifting to watch her, but without the hostility she had described before. "Well, look at him," she said warmly. "Settled in like he never left your side." James nodded, though his smile was faint. "We're getting there." He remembers everything, but the memories aren't always kind. Grace set the bag on the counter and pulled out treats wrapped in butcher paper, a parcel of fresh kibble, and a warm blanket she thought Max might like. "I thought he might need something extra. He's earned it." Max lifted his head, sniffing the air, and trotted cautiously toward the counter, his tail swishing once. James chuckled, a sound rough and unfamiliar on his lips. He always did prefer real food to dry kibble. Grace studied him, noting the heaviness in his eyes. "Don't underestimate what this means to people," she said gently. "Word is spreading. Folks around town are talking about the officer who found his old partner again. Some call it fate, others call it a miracle." James shook his head, his jaw tightening slightly. "I don't care what they call it. He's here. That's enough for me." Grace saw the flicker of something unspoken in his eyes, pride perhaps, or the relief of no longer being entirely alone. She reached out, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "Still, don't shut people out. In a town like ours, we need stories of hope. And you and Max, you're giving us one." James wanted to argue, to retreat behind the fortress of solitude he had built for years, but Max pressed his nose against his hand, as if urging him to accept the truth. Later that evening, as dusk settled over Riverstone, James sat on the porch with Max curled beside his chair. Across the street, Daniel Miller kicked a worn soccer ball alone, his laughter ringing through the air. The ball rolled too far, bouncing against the curb, and Max's ears perked. He stood slowly, limping but curious, and nudged the ball back toward Daniel with his nose. Daniel's face lit with wonder. "Thanks, boy," he called, darting over to scratch Max behind the ears. The autumn days passed quietly in Riverstone, the trees shedding their leaves in slow spirals, the ground littered with gold and rust. James Walker found a rhythm he hadn't known in years, waking to the sound of Max's paws tapping the hardwood floor, wheeling into the kitchen with his partner shadowing his every move, sitting on the porch in the evenings with the comfort of steady breathing at his side. The scars remained, the limp was obvious, but Max had begun to reclaim life in small steps. Daniel visited often now, tossing a ball toward the yard, sneaking scratches behind Max's ears, and laughing with the joy that children carry even in the face of grief. Emily watched from a distance, cautious yet softening, her heart slowly thawing each time she saw her son smile in a way he hadn't since his father's accident. Grace still came by weekly, her paper bags filled with food, supplies, and kindness, telling James that the town whispered about the miracle of a man and his dog reunited. James resisted the word miracle, but deep down he knew they were living on borrowed grace. Then the storm came. It arrived with a restless wind that rattled windows and swept dead leaves into swirling patterns along the narrow streets. By nightfall, the sky opened in fury, rain lashing against rooftops, thunder cracking like gunfire across the hills. The old power line sagged and sparked, and soon the cabin's lights flickered once, twice, before darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the dim glow of the fireplace. James sat in his wheelchair near the hearth, a blanket across his legs, his breath already shallow from the dampness in the air. Max lay curled at his feet, his ears twitching with every rumble, his body tense but unwavering, a guardian against a storm. James reached for his inhaler, the plastic device that had become his lifeline since the explosion left scar tissue in his lungs. But when he pressed down, the hiss sputtered weakly, nearly empty, offering little relief. His chest tightened further, each inhale shorter than the last, panic coiling through him. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, fumbling for the device again, but his hands shook violently. Max lifted his head instantly, amber eyes sharp, body rigid as he sensed a change. He barked once, twice, a sharp alarm cutting through the howl of the wind. James tried to calm him, his voice breaking. "Easy, boy. I'm all right." But the truth betrayed him as another wave of breathlessness struck, leaving him clutching the armrest of his chair, sweat beading along his forehead. Max circled once, whining, his instincts firing like they had in service. He darted to the door, pawing furiously, barking at intervals, his entire frame alive with urgency. James wheezed, unable to rise, unable to follow, his body betraying him in the most vulnerable moment. Then Max did what only desperation could command. He threw his weight against the door, the latch giving under the force, and disappeared into the storm. Across the street, Daniel Miller stood at his bedroom window, his hazel eyes wide as he watched lightning streak the sky. He loved storms, their chaos and noise, but tonight a strange unease kept him restless. when he saw Max racing across the street, his fur plastered by rain, barking wildly at their porch and then turning back toward James's cabin. His heart leapt with fear. "Mom!" he shouted, running down the hall. Emily intercepted him at the door, her face pale with worry. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharp over the roar of the wind. Daniel pointed frantically. "It's Max. He's trying to tell us something." Emily pulled on her raincoat, yanked Daniel's hood over his head, and together they rushed outside. The rain soaked them instantly, the wind biting into their skin, but Max wasted no time. He bolted back across the street, stopping only to bark at them until they followed. Emily's instincts sharpened with dread. Something was wrong. They pushed forward, shielding their faces from the downpour, until they reached James's porch. The door stood ajar, banging in the wind. Inside, the glow of the fire illuminated James slumped in his wheelchair, his face pale, his breath shallow and ragged. Emily rushed to his side, gripping his hand. "James, stay with me," she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. Daniel scrambled to the landline, his small hands shaking as he dialed 911, his voice cracking as he told the operator what was happening. Max stood rigid beside the wheelchair, barking at intervals as though urging them all to act faster. The minutes stretched like hours until the red flash of ambulance lights pierced the rain. 2 EMTs burst through the door, soaked and determined, their jackets reflective in the firelight. One, a heavy-set man with sandy hair, carried an oxygen tank. The other, a lean woman with cropped black hair, rolled in a stretcher. They worked quickly, slipping the mask over James's face, adjusting the flow of oxygen, their voices calm and practiced. Slowly, James's breathing steadied, the rasp easing into shallow but steady pulls. Emily held his hand tightly, whispering encouragement, while Daniel stood frozen, wide-eyed, his chest rising and falling with fear. Through it all, Max stood guard, dripping wet, his amber eyes locked on his partner, daring the storm itself to challenge him. When the EMTs lifted James onto the stretcher, Max pressed close, brushing his muzzle against the man's trembling hand. James's lips moved beneath the mask, his voice faint but clear enough. "Good boy. You saved me." Emily wrapped an arm around Daniel as tears filled her eyes, the truth of the moment sinking in. Daniel whispered to her, awe in his voice, "See, Mom? He's a hero." Later that night, after the ambulance carried James to the hospital and the storm began to fade, Emily and Daniel stood on their porch with Max sitting beside them. His fur was still damp, his body exhausted, but his gaze remained steady, protective, unwavering. Emily knelt, hesitating only a moment before running her fingers gently over his fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're more than just a dog. You're family." Daniel threw his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in the coarse fur. Emily and Daniel stood nearby, offering quiet support. The bond between households now deepened by the night when Max's instincts had saved James's life. The town whispered about it, neighbors passing the story in diners, grocery aisles, and barbershops. "The old K9 saved him," they said. "That shepherd knew before anyone else. He's not just a pet, he's a guardian." James disliked attention, but he could not deny that pride warmed his chest each time he looked at Max. Their story was no longer just about survival. It was about loyalty that refused to die. Yet Riverstone was not without its shadows. In the weeks following the storm, a string of petty thefts unsettled the neighborhood. Garages were broken into, sheds ransacked, wallets and tools missing. At first it seemed like mischief, but as incidents grew more frequent, unease settled in the hearts of residents. James heard the rumors when Grace came by one evening with soup and news. A neighbor found his back door open yesterday. His wallet was gone. This is the third house this month. People are getting nervous. James listened quietly, resting a hand on Max's head. The shepherd lay at his feet, ears flicking, muscles tense, as if sensing his partner's unease. James's instincts, dulled by years of forced silence, sharpened again. "Crime doesn't leave a town like this alone for long," he muttered, his voice low, a shadow of the officer he once was. That night the air was cold and heavy, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. James sat near the window in his wheelchair, a book open in his lap, though his eyes barely scanned the pages. Max lay near the door, his breathing steady, his body curled but alert. Suddenly, the shepherd's ears shot up, his nostrils flaring, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. James froze, recognizing the sound as one that had saved him countless times before. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Max leapt to his feet, barking sharply, claws scratching against the floor as he lunged toward the porch. James's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his veins, an echo of his days in uniform. He reached for the phone, his fingers steady despite the tension. He dialed quickly, his voice clipped but calm. "This is James Walker, retired officer. My dog's alerting. Someone's out there. Send a unit." Outside, Max's barking grew fierce, his body pressed against the gate, his amber eyes locked on a shadow moving across the neighbor's yard. James wheeled forward, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of a lean figure scrambling over the fence, dressed in a dark hoodie, moving with the clumsy desperation of a thief. 2 blocks away, Officer Ryan Carter was on patrol, his cruiser humming down Maple Street when the call came through. He was young, perhaps late 20s, with sandy hair and the energy of someone still eager to prove himself. He knew James's name, had studied his career as a model of service. Without hesitation, he spun the cruiser onto James's street, headlights slicing through the darkness. Max barked louder, his body tense with the urgency of the moment. The suspect darted toward the road, but the sudden blaze of headlights froze him in place. Ryan jumped from the cruiser, his voice ringing with authority. "Police, don't move." The suspect tried to run, but his flight was short-lived. Within moments, Ryan had him pinned against the hood of the car, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. James watched from the porch, his chest swelling with pride as Max barked triumphantly, his tail stiff but his stance strong. He whistled sharply, and Max returned to his side immediately, obedient even in the heat of chaos. Ryan glanced toward the cabin, nodding with respect. "Good call, Mr. Walker. And good dog." James stroked Max's head, his voice thick with emotion. "He's more than good. He's my partner." The news spread quickly through Riverstone. By morning, everyone knew that Max had not only saved James from a storm, but also helped catch a thief prowling their quiet neighborhood. At the diner, townsfolk called him the Night Watch. At the post office, children whispered about the hero dog who caught criminals in the dark. At the elementary school, Daniel could barely contain his excitement as he sat at his small desk, pencil scratching furiously across a notebook. His assignment had been to write about a hero. While classmates chose firefighters, athletes, or soldiers, Daniel wrote with determination, pressing hard into the paper. "My hero is a dog." He described how Max had barked during the storm, saving James's life, and how he had caught a thief by warning the police. He wrote about loyalty, about bravery, about how true heroes didn't always walk on 2 legs. When Emily read the essay later that night, her tired face softened, a smile breaking through the shadows of grief she carried. She laid a hand on Daniel's shoulder and whispered, "Your father would be proud of you." Daniel's hazel eyes glowed, pride shining through his innocence. At school, Daniel's teacher, Mrs. Parker, a petite woman with sharp glasses and a kind smile, was so moved by the essay that she read it aloud to the class. Soon parents heard it, then neighbors, and within days the local newspaper carried the headline, "Boy calls K9 his hero, community agrees." James read the article silently on his porch, Max lying at his side with amber eyes half closed. Neighbors stopped by more often now, some bringing treats for Max, others shaking James's hand with quiet respect. He accepted their words humbly, but deep inside he felt the truth. It was Max who had given him back not only his life, but his place in the community. That evening James sat with Daniel on the porch. The boy leaned against the railing, notebook still in hand, eyes bright with admiration. Max lay stretched out between them, his muzzle gray, but his gaze alert, as if he knew he had become more than a dog. He had become a legend in the making. Daniel looked up at James suddenly, his voice earnest. "I want to be like you someday." Now his porch became a place of gathering, a quiet stage where neighbors left offerings not out of pity, but out of admiration. One morning, James wheeled onto the porch to find a small box tied with string. Inside was a package of biscuits with a note scrawled in a child's handwriting, "For Max, the hero dog." James lifted the note slowly, his throat tightening, and called Max to his side. The shepherd sniffed the biscuits, tail wagging once, his amber eyes brightening with curiosity. James rubbed his head gently and whispered, "Looks like you got fans, partner." Days later, a retired veteran stopped by, his frame stooped, but his eyes steady, carrying a leash embroidered with the words "Never Forgotten." He explained that he had heard Max's story at the American Legion post and wanted to honor the dog who reminded him of his own canine from decades before. James accepted it quietly, running his fingers over the stitching, his chest swelling with pride as Max stood beside him, dignified in his calm strength. It was a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. The community's response was not limited to gifts. People began stopping James on the street when he wheeled to the diner or the post office, their words soft but filled with awe. "He's given us hope," one woman said, clutching her grocery bags. "In a world that feels so dark, your story reminds us there's still light." James would nod, uncomfortable with the attention, but unable to deny the truth. Hope had returned not just to him, but to those who had witnessed his second chance. Max had become more than a dog. He was a symbol of survival, a living testament that loyalty could withstand fire, time, and loss. Yet for James, the healing was not only public, but deeply personal. One evening he sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, Max stretched at his feet, his head resting against James's boot. Across the street, Daniel kicked a soccer ball alone, his laughter echoing faintly through the crisp air. When the ball rolled too far, Max lifted his head, ears flicking, and rose to his feet. He limped slightly, but moved forward, nudging the ball back with his nose. Daniel's face lit with joy. "Thanks, boy," he called, running over to give Max a quick scratch behind the ear. Max wagged his tail cautiously, but allowed the touch, leaning into the boy's hand. James watched, his chest tightening at the simple beauty of the moment. Emily soon stepped onto her porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She called gently, "Don't stay out too late, Daniel. Dinner's almost ready." Her eyes drifted across the street to James, offering a small but genuine smile. James raised his hand in greeting, and for once, the exchange did not feel like an intrusion, but like an opening. Emily had endured her own share of loss, raising Daniel alone after her husband's accident, her strength cloaked in quiet resilience. She guarded her heart carefully, but seeing her son smile with Max seemed to soften something within her. As the nights grew colder, James often found himself recounting old patrol stories aloud by the fire. He would speak softly, describing nights of pursuit, the bark that signaled danger, the weight of Max's presence when fear threatened to overwhelm him. Max would lift his head, ears twitching, amber eyes fixed on his voice, as though remembering too. Yet even as old memories returned, new ones began to take root. James found himself laughing more when Daniel visited, exchanging nods with Emily at the mailbox, listening to Grace remind him that Riverstone needed stories like his. Healing was not quick or grand. It was steady, like a wound closing day by day. One particularly cool evening, James sat with Grace as she brought more supplies. "You know, the town talks about fate and miracles," she said, her hazel eyes shining in the firelight. James shook his head slowly. "I don't know about miracles, but I know this. I thought I was finished. Then Max came back. Now I feel like I've been given another mission." Grace smiled softly. Sometimes miracles are just second chances wearing scars. James looked down at Max, who lifted his head, his gaze steady, and he felt the truth of her words sink deep into his soul. The healing spread beyond James's porch. Riverstone, a town often quiet and weary, began to carry a new energy. Neighbors who had once kept their distance from the man in the wheelchair now lingered to share kind words. Children whispered about Max, as though he were a character from a storybook, drawing pictures of him with capes and badges. At school, Daniel's essay continued to ripple outward, inspiring teachers to talk about loyalty, courage, and second chances. Emily noticed the difference in her son too. He woke early, eager to spend time with Max, his laughter filling the air in a way she thought she might never hear again. Late one evening, as James wheeled back into his cabin, he looked around the room and felt something had shifted. The walls no longer pressed in on him with silence. The weight of his loss had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something stronger: connection, purpose, and the fragile but undeniable return of belonging. By now, weeks had passed since the night of the storm, and the memory of James Walker gasping for breath while Max tore through the rain to summon help had settled into local legend. The arrest of the thief had only deepened the conviction that this dog was not just any companion, but a guardian sent to remind the town that loyalty and courage still mattered. Yet James did not imagine what would come next. One chilly Saturday morning, Grace Martinez stopped by his cabin carrying envelopes and packages tucked under her arms. She set them down on the table with a smile that spoke of secrets. "You've got a lot of admirers," she said warmly, brushing auburn strands from her face. "It seems half the town has been writing to you." James looked down at the pile, his brow furrowed. He opened one envelope carefully and found a child's drawing of Max wearing a superhero cape, a bold scrawl beneath it reading, "Thank you, hero." Another letter came from a woman who had lost her husband to illness, telling James that his story gave her hope that love survives in unexpected ways. James's chest tightened as he read, and when he glanced at Max stretched out on the rug, he whispered, "You don't even know what you're doing, do you? You're healing more than me." Grace tapped his arm gently. "That's why I want you both at the shelter this weekend. Nothing fancy, just a way for the town to say thank you." James hesitated. He had never liked being the center of attention, but Grace's eyes carried a warmth that dissolved his resistance. That Saturday, the shelter yard filled with folding chairs and neighbors. A banner hung across the fence, painted by local children, "Companion of Honor." James wheeled into the yard with Max walking proudly at his side, his coat brushed clean, his eyes alert though softened by the familiar presence of his partner. Daniel stood at the front, bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement, Emily's steady hand resting on his shoulder. Grace stepped forward, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "We are here today to honor not just a dog, but a story. Max has proven that courage doesn't fade with time, and loyalty doesn't die in the dark. He has saved lives, reminded us of faith, and shown us the meaning of second chances." She turned toward Daniel, holding out a small box. And who better to present this than the boy who reminded us all what a hero truly looks like? Daniel's hands shook as he opened the box, revealing a medal attached to a sturdy leather strap engraved with the words "Companion of Honor." His hazel eyes glistened as he knelt in front of Max, fastening it carefully around the shepherd's neck. "For you, buddy," he whispered, his voice trembling with pride. The crowd erupted in applause. Some clapped loudly, others wiped tears from their eyes, and veterans saluted quietly, their faces solemn with respect. Children pressed drawings into James's lap, each one scribbled with images of dogs and badges. Max stood tall, his tail swishing once, his gaze sweeping the crowd as though acknowledging them all. James swallowed hard, brushing his hand across his mouth to steady himself. He reached down, ruffling Max's ear, and murmured with a wry smile, "Looks like you've outrank me now." The ceremony was simple, but its impact was profound. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now lined up to pat Max's head, their words filled with admiration and gratitude. Emily stood quietly to the side, her eyes glistening as she watched her son beam with joy. When James wheeled closer, she met his gaze with a smile that carried both respect and unspoken gratitude. "You've given this town hope," she said softly. "And my son," he looks at Max and sees the kind of hero every child should believe in. James nodded, emotion tightening his throat. Sometimes the right partner saves more than one life. Daniel threw his arms around Max's neck, whispering, "You're the best partner ever." The medal glinted in the fading sunlight, the shepherd's posture dignified, his amber eyes shining with a quiet light. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the yard grew still, James wheeled himself home with Max walking steadily beside him. The metal around the dog's neck clicked softly against his chest, each sound like a reminder that their bond had not only survived, but had become something larger than themselves. Back at the cabin, James parked his wheelchair near the window and looked at Max stretched across the rug, the metal gleaming faintly in the firelight. He whispered into the quiet, "You're not just my past, Max. You're my present, and maybe the reason I've still got a future." Max's eyes closed slowly, but his tail brushed once against the floor, a silent answer that spoke louder than words. The ceremony had not erased their scars. James still carried the weight of his legs lost to the explosion, the nights of silence when despair had nearly broken him. Max still flinched at sudden noises, his body marked by scars from battles no one had witnessed. But the metal symbolized something greater, proof that brokenness did not mean uselessness. Together, they had stepped from the shadows back into the light, and in doing so, they had pulled a community with them. Over the following days, the recognition continued. The local newspaper ran another story with photographs from the ceremony. James found himself approached at the diner by strangers offering handshakes, their eyes shining with respect. Max, once the ghost in a shelter cage, now walked through town with children calling his name, their laughter echoing as they patted his head. Daniel carried a new confidence to school, writing in his notebook about heroes not as distant figures, but as companions who lived next door. Emily, though cautious, found herself smiling more often, her evenings filled with the sound of her son's laughter carried across the street. For James, the medal was not about honor, but about healing. Spring rolled gently into summer in Riverstone, the lilacs blooming along the fences and children's laughter returning to the narrow streets that had once carried only the weight of silence. James Walker wheeled himself down the familiar path outside the town's shelter one morning, Max walking faithfully at his side, the medal of companion of honor glinting faintly in the sunlight. The dog's steps were slower now, each one deliberate, his muzzle streaked with gray, but his amber eyes still carried the fire of a guardian. James felt the tug of something greater, a pull that whispered he had not been brought this far just to sit quietly at home. When Grace greeted him at the shelter gate, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, she studied him curiously. "You've got that look again," she teased. James smiled faintly. "I want to start something here. Not just adoption, but training, healing. Dogs like Max, written off, scarred, broken, they deserve another chance. We can give it to them." Grace's hazel eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "You mean make Max the teacher?" James reached down to pat his partner's head. "Exactly. He's proof that scars don't have to end a story. He can show them the way back." Within weeks, the shelter yard was transformed. Crates, leashes, and supplies filled the space, donated by neighbors who believed in the idea. Officer Ryan Carter delivered equipment from the precinct. Emily came after long shifts at the diner, and Daniel was there every morning with his notebook, scribbling drawings of commands and writing mottos, like heroes, never quit. The first group of dogs was a mixture of fear and defiance. Daisy, a timid golden mix, whose eyes darted nervously at every sound. Max, a bulky pit bull misunderstood by many, but gentle when treated with patience. And Scout, a wiry terrier who barked furiously, but longed for stability. Max entered the yard with calm authority, his posture slow but steady. Daisy, normally trembling, inched closer when he lay down in the grass. Max the pit bull mirrored the shepherd's composure, while Scout circled wildly before settling down to watch. James guided Max through old commands: sit, stay, heel. Each one performed with quiet precision. The other dogs watched, some mimicking hesitantly, others resisting. But slowly progress began to unfold. Grace watched from the fence, her eyes damp with emotion. "He really is teaching them," she whispered. Emily folded her arms, smiling softly as Daniel scribbled furiously, capturing every moment. "You've given him something to look forward to," she told James. After his father passed, he shut down. Now he wakes up with hope. James's throat tightened. He looked at Max, who gently nudged Daisy forward toward Daniel and whispered, "It wasn't me. It was him. He gave us all another chance." Weeks stretched into months, and the program grew. More dogs arrived, each carrying scars of their own. Some were rehomed after finding their confidence. Others remained longer, needing more time. But all of them changed in the quiet presence of the shepherd who had once been written off himself. The shelter, once a place of sorrow, became a place of beginnings, and Riverstone itself seemed to hum with renewal. One Saturday afternoon, the yard was alive with laughter. Children darted between kennels, parents chatted with neighbors, and volunteers passed out lemonade. James sat beneath a maple tree, Max resting at his side, watching Daniel throw a ball across the grass. Max, slower than his younger days, still jogged after it and returned with careful precision. Daniel's laughter rang high and clear, melting years of heaviness from James's chest. Emily leaned against the fence, her face softened by the glow of the setting sun, her eyes meeting James's with unspoken warmth. For once, James did not look away. As the day wound down, Max lay down beside the wheelchair, panting lightly, the metal still shining against his chest. James rested his hand on the shepherd's head, his voice low, almost a prayer. "Thank you for finding your way back to me, and thank you for bringing us all back to life." Max's eyes closed slowly, his body easing into rest, but his tail tapped once against the grass as though to agree. In the months that followed, James and Max's program became more than local. Newspapers carried the story of the retired officer and his lost canine who now trained broken dogs to trust again. Donations came from neighboring towns, volunteers drove hours to join, and Riverstone became a place where second chances weren't just given to dogs, but to people who had lost their way. Daniel thrived, his essays and drawings now pinned proudly in his classroom, his voice bright with dreams of becoming a policeman. Emily found her own strength renewed, her evenings no longer heavy with solitude, but filled with community, laughter, and hope. Grace watched from the sidelines, smiling with quiet pride at what her shelter had become. And James, once a man bound not just to a wheelchair but to grief, discovered that he was no longer alone. He was part of something larger, something born from pain but transformed into purpose. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, James wheeled himself to the porch, Max curled at his side, the metal glinting faintly in the fading light. Daniel's laughter carried across the street, Emily's voice calling him in for dinner, and the air smelled of lilacs and cut grass. James looked upward, the sky vast and endless, and whispered, "We were broken, Max. But broken doesn't mean the end. Broken means we're ready to build again." Max opened his eyes briefly, leaned his head against James's boot, and exhaled in the peace of a dog who knew his mission was fulfilled. In the end, James understood that their story was never just about survival. It was about redemption, about how scars can become a testimony, about how even when life shatters us, loyalty and love can piece us back together. Max had been more than his past, more than a canine lost in the dark. He had become a teacher, a guardian, and a bridge between despair and hope. And James, once alone, now carried the legacy of second chances, not only for himself and Max, but for every life their story had touched. The end. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Tell me in the comments what part of the story moved you the most, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Your thoughts and stories keep this community alive.